For hours, they walked among the fragrant flowers and softly glowing lights of the garden. He spoke of his world, of the human strange customs, and their belief in courage, loyalty, and hope. She listened, fascinated, and began to share stories of her childhood, of her people, of the pressures and expectations she carried. For the first time, she felt heard, truly heard, without judgment or expectation. By the time the moon rose high, casting silver over the palace walls, Liara realized something profound. The fear that had ruled her heart was no longer absolute. In its place was a cautious trust, fragile but growing. She had been forced into this marriage, yes, but she was beginning to see that this human groom so strange, so unpredictable, might be the one person who could teach her courage, companionship, and even a form of love she had never imagined possible. As they parted that night, his hand lingering briefly in hers, Liara whispered softly, "Thank you for seeing me." He simply smiled, a quiet, steady smile. Always. And in that moment, Princess Liara knew that her trembling heart had begun to change, not from fear, but from the first gentle stirrings of trust, admiration, and hope. Weeks turned into months, and the palace slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Yet for Princess Liara, nothing felt ordinary anymore. The human groom, once a stranger she had feared, had become a quiet anchor in her life. He was present in every council meeting, every city inspection, every strategy discussion, but more importantly, he had become present in her thoughts, her reflections, and her heart. Liara had observed him in countless situations, calm under pressure, decisive without arrogance, and gentle with those weaker or frightened. The way he lifted a child who had been separated from their parents during a festival, or how he offered a reassuring hand to an elderly servant, left her in awe. She had grown to understand that humans measured strength differently than her people did. Strength was not only in command or titles. Strength was in courage, loyalty, and the willingness to stand for what mattered. And in that, he excelled. One evening, Liara found herself in the palace library, a place where she had spent countless hours studying politics and history. The human was already there, reading a strange book of human philosophy, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up and smiled when he noticed her. "You spend too much time alone, Princess," he teased gently. Lyra's lips curved in a faint smile. "And you spend too much time reading things I cannot understand," she replied, a small spark of humor in her voice. He closed the book and gestured for her to sit beside him. "Then teach me to understand your world, and I will try to teach you mine." For hours they exchanged ideas, stories, and traditions. He listened with patience and asked questions that made her think deeply, not because he doubted her, but because he genuinely wanted to know. In turn, he shared stories of Earth, of human struggles and triumphs, of courage born in small moments of kindness or daring decisions. Liara found herself laughing, imagining worlds she had never known, feeling a closeness she had never thought possible with someone she had barely met before her marriage. Over time, their partnership began to shift into something subtler and more profound. Liara no longer felt forced. She felt chosen, even in small ways. The human valued her opinions, respected her judgments, and included her in plans not as a ceremonial princess, but as a partner. Slowly, admiration blossomed into something tender, something delicate that neither of them named aloud, but both felt deeply. One night, after a long day of council meetings and city inspections, Liara found herself leaning on the balcony, staring at the starlit city. The human stepped beside her, his hand brushing lightly against hers. She did not pull away. "You've changed," he said softly, his gaze on the horizon. "Not just because of what you do, but because of who you allow yourself to be." Liara turned to him, surprised by the depth in his words. "And you make it easier to be brave," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, a quiet, steady smile that seemed to carry the weight of understanding and the promise of protection. "Because I believe in you," he said. "And because humans, we see what others overlook. We see the courage inside, even when it is hidden by fear." Liara felt her chest tighten. His words were simple, but they carried a truth that resonated in every fiber of her being. For the first time, she realized that she was no longer trembling out of fear. She was trembling from admiration, trust, and a growing bond that neither protocol nor duty could define. As the night stretched on, they stood side by side, gazing at the stars. The city below was calm, safe, and thriving, yet more importantly, Liara felt a quiet certainty in her heart. The human beside her was no longer just a groom assigned by duty. He was a companion, a guide, a protector. And perhaps, though she dared not say it yet, something far more meaningful. And in that quiet moment, under the silver glow of the stars, Princess Liara understood the truth she had been too afraid to admit. The bond forming between them was real. And it had the power to transform not just her life, but the world around them. The city trembled under the shadow of a new threat. Intelligence had warned that a rival faction would strike, seeking to destabilize the fragile alliance between humans and Lyra's people. The princess stood on the balcony, her hands gripping the railing, the weight of her people pressing on her chest. Beside her, her human groom remained calm, his presence steady like a rock in the midst of a storm. "Are you ready?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying neither fear nor hesitation. Liara took a deep breath. She had been forced into this marriage, yes, but she was no longer the trembling girl who feared the unknown. She had seen courage firsthand, had felt the warmth of trust, had experienced loyalty and partnership in a way that defied every expectation she had held of humans. And now, standing beside him, she felt the first true sense of power in her own hands, not from titles or commands, but from choice. The attack came swiftly, but the city was ready. Liara and her groom moved through the corridors of command together, their strategies aligning perfectly. Civilians were evacuated efficiently, defenses reinforced, and the defenders inspired by their leader's unwavering courage. Liara watched him in action, his mind sharp, calculating, and yet full of compassion. He did not strike recklessly. He struck where it mattered, saving lives rather than chasing glory. In the heart of the battle, Liara found herself facing a group of intruders who had breached the inner palace walls. Her pulse quickened, but she did not falter. The human appeared at her side, shielding her without question. "Trust yourself," he said. "And trust me." She did. With him covering her, she guided the defenders, issuing orders that blended her knowledge of the palace with his human intuition. Together, they outmaneuvered the invaders, each action precise, each decision deliberate. Their partnership, born of fear and duty, strengthened through trust and understanding, became unstoppable. Finally, the last of the intruders were captured or driven off. The city was safe. The night air, heavy with smoke and the scent of battle, began to clear. Liara looked around at the people, the citizens she had been trained to protect, and saw them cheering, not just for survival, but for the leaders who had inspired them. Turning to her human groom, she felt a rush of emotion she could not contain. "I feared this marriage," she admitted softly, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with gratitude and awe. "I thought I would be alone in facing everything. But you changed everything." He took her hands in his, holding them gently, firmly. "We changed it together," he said. "I only did what any human would do for someone they care about. But you led with wisdom, courage, and heart. You've grown stronger than you know." Lyra's chest tightened. Her eyes glistened as she realized the truth she had been too afraid to name. This marriage, once a command and a chain, had become a bond born of respect, trust, and admiration. She no longer trembled at the thought of him. She looked at him with certainty, with gratitude, and with a spark of something far deeper. The stars above reflected in their eyes as they stood together. The city safe, their people inspired, and their bond unbreakable. For the first time in her life, Liara understood what it truly meant to choose courage over fear, trust over doubt, and hope over despair. "You are more than I ever imagined," she whispered. Her voice steady now. "And so are you," he replied, smiling softly. "The galaxy tried to force us into a life we did not want. But we chose this life together, and that choice makes all the difference." In that moment, under the silver glow of a victorious night sky, Princess Liara realized the full power of the human beside her. Not strength of body, nor weapons, nor speed, but courage, loyalty, and heart. She had been forced into marriage, yet she had gained a companion who inspired her to be brave, who stood with her as an equal, and who showed her that humans, strange, unpredictable, and fearless, could change a galaxy simply by standing for what was right. And so, together, they faced the future not as ruler and subject, not as stranger and stranger, but as partners bound by choice, courage, and an unbreakable trust that would echo through the stars for generations to come. Kale had always walked alone. The barren mountains of Zephyra stretched endlessly beneath a sky that constantly shifted between violent storms and pale, cold sunlight. He had grown used to the wind whipping against his face, the sharp rocks under his boots, and the eerie silence that followed him wherever he went. Every day, Kale patrolled the cliffs surrounding the alien city, sword in hand, heart heavy with loneliness. No one spoke to him except through formal orders, and even those were distant, clipped, and cold. To Kale, the universe seemed vast and empty, as if he had been placed there only to endure, not to live. In the heart of the city lived Princess Lyra, an alien of exquisite grace and intelligence. She moved among crystal towers that reflected the sun like liquid diamonds, her every step precise and deliberate. Kale often watched her from afar as he patrolled, his curiosity mixed with caution. She was always surrounded by silence, as if her presence alone could command the world to hold its breath. Sometimes he thought she must notice him too, but he could never be sure. He had tried to speak to her once, shouting across the garden terraces, but she hadn't answered. Ever since then, Kale assumed she could not hear him. He muttered to himself as he walked, words spilling into the empty air. "I swear, if anyone else had to guard this place, they'd run screaming," he said one day, his voice cracking under frustration. "All day, all night, and for what? A palace full of crystal and people who barely know your name. Nobody cares if I live or die." Kale's hands clenched around his sword as the wind tore through the valley, and he thought of how easy it would be to let the universe swallow him whole. Yet still he stood, because that was what warriors did. Lyra watched him silently. From a distance, she leaned against a balcony railing, eyes fixed on the lone figure who moved like a shadow against the jagged cliffs. She had heard every complaint, every curse, every lonely mutter Kale had ever thrown into the wind. But she never responded. Not once. Her silence was deliberate, a quiet observation that she hoped would someday reach him, not through her voice, but through understanding. She saw the way he carried, the invisible chains of isolation that bound him. One evening, as purple clouds gathered over the mountains, Kale found himself speaking louder than usual. "I've fought through storms stronger than this, faced beasts that could tear men apart, and yet here I am, standing for people who don't even notice." His voice was rough, edged with frustration, but also with a raw vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to feel. He leaned against the cold stone walls of the palace gardens, staring at the endless horizon. Wondering if anyone could ever truly understand the ache inside him, Lyra took a small step forward, hidden behind the columns, letting the last rays of sunlight catch her hair. She did not interrupt. She did not speak. Yet Kale's words reached her in a way no one else has ever had. She understood the loneliness that came from being strong, from carrying responsibility heavier than one's own heart could bear. And she felt an unfamiliar pull in her chest, a quiet, human-like desire to reach out, to bridge the vast distance between them. But Kale didn't notice her. He didn't see the faint shimmer of awareness in her eyes, or the tiny pause she took to breathe in the sound of his words. He was too consumed by his own world, the solitary path of a warrior, and the endless echo of his own thoughts. He believed, as he always had, that he was alone in the universe, guarding a princess who could never truly hear him, and yet, unknowingly, every word, every sigh, every cry of exhaustion was being carried to someone who listened, someone who cared. Kale continued his patrol under the rising moon, unaware that the princess had been listening to him all along. Her eyes followed his movements, not with judgment, but with a growing respect. For the first time, the distance between them felt alive with possibility, though neither of them fully realized it yet. Kale, the lonely warrior, and Lyra, the silent observer, had begun a story that neither could yet imagine, a story of courage, understanding, and the quiet power of being truly seen. The night air was thick with tension. Kale stood at the edge of the palace walls, sword in hand, eyes scanning the jagged mountains below. The winds of Zephyra howled through the cliffs, carrying with them an unsettling sense of foreboding. He had grown used to storms and shadows, but tonight felt different. The silence pressed down on him like a living thing, and his instincts whispered that something dangerous was coming. For weeks, scouts had reported distant movements, small, fleeting shadows that slipped across the valleys. Kale had dismissed them as wandering animals, but tonight, the feeling in his gut would not let him. He crouched behind a stone parapet, listening. The faint whirring of engines reached his ears, growing louder. Then, a chilling sight, marauders armed and ruthless swarming toward the palace gates. They had come for the crystals, the heart of Zephyra's wealth, and nothing would stop their greed. Kale drew a deep breath, muscles tightening. He ran to the main gate, preparing for battle. The first wave of marauders crashed against the palace defenses like wild storms. Kale moved with precision, his sword flashing under the pale moonlight. He struck one, then another, feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline. But this fight was different. It wasn't just about skill, it was about protecting something fragile and beautiful. Something he didn't fully understand yet. Amid the chaos, he shouted, unaware that his voice carried to someone who was listening. "Hold the gates. Don't let them through." His words echoed off the stone walls, sharp and commanding. Kale thought Lyra would not hear, thought she remained safe behind her crystalline palace, but he could not have been more wrong. Lyra watched from a balcony above, heart racing. She had never seen the warrior like this, so fierce, so determined. Every swing of his sword, every calculated move, revealed the depth of his courage. And yet, he believed he fought alone. She wanted to call out, to warn him of a group sneaking from the cliffs, but she stayed silent. Instead, she observed, learning the rhythm of his movements. Seeing not just the warrior but the man beneath the armor. The one who fought even when exhaustion clawed at his body. Kale's sword clashed with the marauder's weapons, sparks flying. He gritted his teeth as one enemy slipped past the first line of defense, raising his weapon to strike. In a flash, Kale intercepted, his blade meeting theirs with a deafening clang. He fought like a storm himself, yet even the bravest warriors could falter when outnumbered. The drones above began to hum, mechanical eyes glowing red, scanning for any movement. Kale knew he had to act quickly. He barked orders to soldiers he barely knew by name, guiding them like a commander and a protector rolled into one. "Left flank. Cover the gates. Do not let them reach the crystal hall." His voice, harsh and demanding, carried over the chaos, and yet, all the while, Lyra could hear every word. Every command, every shout, every breathless curse. She realized he wasn't just a fighter. He was someone who bore the weight of the entire palace on his shoulders, and he did it without complaint. Without asking for thanks, the battle raged until the first light of dawn painted the mountains in shades of crimson and gold. The marauders, exhausted and injured, retreated. Kale stood panting, sword slick with sweat and grime, surveying the battlefield. His armor bore scratches, his body throbbed with pain, but he had held the palace. He had survived. Then, he noticed her. Lyra stepped forward, her face pale but glowing in the morning light. "You fought bravely," she said softly, her voice like a gentle breeze over the chaos. Kale froze. Her words cut through the fog of battle, and for the first time, he realized she had heard him all along, heard his mutters, his complaints, his loneliness. He looked at her, stunned, as the weight of her gaze fell upon him, not with judgment, but with understanding. For a moment, Kale felt exposed, vulnerable, and yet, seen. For the first time in his life, someone had truly noticed him, not just the warrior, but the man beneath the armor. And he understood that the silent observer he had dismissed for so long might hold the key to something he had never dared hope for: connection. The morning after the attack was quiet, almost unreal. Smoke from the skirmish still drifted across the valley, curling into the pale sunlight like ghostly fingers. Kale moved through the palace grounds, inspecting the damage, his armor still scorched and dented from the battle. Every step reminded him of the fight and the toll it had taken, not just on his body, but on his mind. For a moment, he allowed himself a sigh, a small, human admission that the endless loneliness weighed heavier than any blade. Lyra appeared quietly beside him. She moved with the same calm grace she always possessed, but there was an intensity in her eyes that Kale had never seen before. She handed him a small vial of healing liquid, her hand steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "Here," she said softly. "It will help with the burns. You shouldn't push yourself too far." Kale blinked, caught off guard. I don't need," he started, but she interrupted with a gentle shake of her head. "Yes, you do. You risk everything for this palace. For all of us. That alone deserves care." Her words struck him in a way few had. He was used to orders, commands, and cold gratitude, but this was different. There was no expectation, no protocol, only acknowledgement. Kale took the vial with a nod, finally allowing himself to feel the exhaustion in his arms and legs. The silence between and them was heavy, but not awkward. It was the kind of silence that carried understanding, the beginning of a bridge neither had crossed before. "I thought you couldn't hear me," Kale admitted quietly, almost to himself. "All those times I muttered complaints, cursed my luck, and wondered if anyone cared. I thought I was alone." Lyra's eyes softened. "I heard everything," she said simply. "Every word. And I watched. I wanted to see you not as a warrior, but as a man. And now, after seeing what you did yesterday, I understand why you fight, why you endure." Kale swallowed, the weight of her gaze and her words pressing against his chest. For the first time, He realized that the loneliness he had carried for years wasn't because no one cared. It was because no one had truly seen him. And now, the princess, the alien who seemed untouchable and distant, was seeing him completely. Over the next days, Cale found himself walking with her through the palace gardens. The crystal fountains caught the sunlight and scattered it like rainbows across the stones. He spoke to her about his training, the battles he had fought, the worlds he had seen. For the first time, he spoke not to an invisible void, but to someone who listened, who understood, who could even challenge him in subtle, meaningful ways. Lyra shared her own fears and dreams, though carefully. She spoke of the pressures of being a princess, of responsibilities that weighed heavier than any weapon. Cale listened, amazed that someone so delicate yet strong could carry such burdens. He began to see her not just as royalty, but as a person who fought her own battles. Invisible to the world, yet no less fierce than he was. One evening, as the twin moons of Zephyra rose into the sky, they sat together on the cliffs overlooking the valley. The wind tugged at their clothes and hair, but neither moved away. Cale felt a quiet connection settle between them, a fragile thread of trust and understanding. "I've never had someone see me like this," he admitted. Lyra reached out and placed her hand lightly on his arm. "Then perhaps it is time you let someone in," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. It was not a command, not an order, just a gentle invitation. Cale looked into her eyes and for the first time allowed himself to hope. He realized that the bond between them was growing. Not from duty or necessity, but from something more human: connection, trust, and the fragile, powerful understanding that they were no longer alone. As they sat in silence under the moons, Cale understood that the battles they fought together were more than physical. They were shaping something deeper, a bond forged in fire, strengthened by vulnerability and built on the simple truth that sometimes the greatest strength is the courage to let someone see you completely. And for Cale, that realization was both terrifying and exhilarating, because for the first time in his life, he did not have to face the world alone. The peaceful days after the first battle gave the palace a false sense of security. Cale had grown accustomed to the rhythm of patrols and the quiet hum of the palace gardens. But tranquility was fragile, like thin ice over a dark river. One morning, scouts brought news that made Cale's blood run cold. A larger fleet of marauders was heading straight for the palace, armed with heavier weapons and strange, glowing drones that could burn through the strongest defenses. Cale's instincts screamed danger. He ran through the palace corridors, checking barricades and alerting the guards. The soldiers moved with practiced efficiency, but Cale could sense their fear. They had seen the drones before, machines that did not tire, did not fear, and did not show mercy. "Listen to me," Cale shouted, his voice steady but urgent. "Stay in formation. Protect the princess. Nothing gets through." He moved with precision, his mind calculating the odds, predicting the enemy's strategy. Lyra appeared beside him unexpectedly. Cale froze for a moment, startled not just by her presence, but by the resolve shining in her eyes. She pointed toward the control room of the palace, where the ancient defense systems remained unused. "Cale, I can activate the palace defenses," she said. "I've studied the systems for years. I can fight too, if you let me." Cale hesitated. He had always imagined Lyra as delicate, someone to protect, not someone who could take charge in battle. But the certainty in her voice left no room for argument. "Do it," he said, stepping back to give her space. In a blur of movement, Lyra raced through the corridors, reaching the ancient control panels. Her fingers danced over the glowing interface, and suddenly, turrets along the walls whirred to life, shields shimmered into place, and energy barriers hummed with power. Cale's jaw dropped. He had never imagined the princess could fight like this, not with weapons, but with her mind, her strategy, her understanding of the palace itself. The marauders arrived soon after, their drones buzzing like angry insects. Cale met them head-on, swinging his sword with a mix of fury and precision. But every time a drone swooped close, Lyra's shields deflected their energy blasts. Together, they became a force impossible to stop. Cale was the storm, and Lyra the calm eye at its center, guiding the fury with intelligence and skill. During a brief lull, Cale glanced at her. She was calm, focused, her eyes gleaming with determination. He realized she had been listening all along, not just to him, but to the palace, to the patterns of movement, to the whispers of danger that no one else could hear. The thought struck him deeply. He had underestimated her, as he had underestimated the universe itself. As the battle raged, Cale found himself shouting instructions, Not just to the soldiers but to Lyra as well. Left flank. Redirect the turret. Watch the drones. He was no longer the lonely warrior shouting into the void. She responded instantly, her decision swift and accurate, proving that strength comes in many forms, and that true leadership is not measured by who holds a sword, but by who can see the path forward. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the last marauder had retreated. Smoke and dust hung in the air, the palace battered but unbroken. Cale and Lyra stood side by side, breathing heavily, surveying the aftermath. Cale felt a rush of admiration and something more, an understanding that he had never shared this kind of battle with anyone before. And the princess had fought beside him, not just as royalty, but as a warrior in her own right. Lyra turned to him, her expression softening. "You thought I couldn't fight," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. Cale shook his head, still catching his breath. "I didn't know. I never imagined." For the first time, Cale realized the depth of her strength. She had not only saved the palace, but had also changed the way he saw the world and himself. The lonely warrior was no longer alone, and the princess was far more capable than anyone had ever believed. That night, as they watched the stars from the palace terrace, Cale understood something he had never allowed himself to feel before. Admiration can turn into trust, and trust can turn into something far stronger, something worth fighting for beyond the battlefield. The nights on Zephyra had a quiet, almost sacred feeling. The winds whispered across the cliffs, carrying the scent of alien flowers from the crystal gardens below. Cale and Lyra had grown used to these walks along the palace terraces, moving in silence at first, but gradually sharing pieces of themselves, small, fragile truths that no one else had heard before. That evening, the twin moons rose slowly, bathing the palace in pale silver light. Cale leaned against the railing, staring out at the valley below, lost in thought. He could still feel the burn of the previous battle in his muscles. But it was not the pain that weighed on him, it was the memory of what he had always carried alone, the fear of being invisible, of speaking and having no one truly hear him. Lyra approached quietly, her footsteps light on the crystalline floor. She stopped beside him, her gaze following his toward the distant mountains. "Cale," she said softly, "do you ever feel that no one really sees you? That your efforts, your struggles go unnoticed?" Cale looked at her, surprised. For so long, he had thought himself alone in that feeling. "Every day," he admitted. His voice was rough, almost hesitant, but it held a truth he had rarely spoken aloud. "I've always fought, always protected, but it felt like no one really noticed. No one knew me. Just the armor, the sword, the duty." Lyra turned her head to look at him, the silver light catching the edges of her delicate features. "I've seen you," she said simply. "Not the armor, not the sword, but you. Every exhausted sigh, every muttered complaint, every quiet moment when no one else is watching, I've seen it all. And I understand it. You're not just a warrior, Cale. You're human." For a moment, Cale's heart stopped. He had never been called human in that way before, as if his fears, his pain, his doubts were not weaknesses but proof that he was alive, proof that he mattered. He swallowed hard, the silence stretching between them, heavy and full of unspoken emotion. "I always thought I was alone," Cale admitted finally, his voice low, almost a whisper. "That nobody could understand, or even wanted to understand." He paused, looking down at his hands. "And yet here you are, standing beside me, seeing me, listening." Lyra reached out and lightly placed her hand on his arm. The touch was gentle, but it sent a warmth through Cale that he hadn't felt in years. "I was always here," she said. "Even when you didn't know it. Even when you thought you spoke into empty air, I heard you. And I waited for you to speak the truth, not your complaints, but the real you."